The hour Rome pretended was normal Rome did not begin its bloodshed with heroes. It began with people no one would miss. Before the cheers, before the legends, there was an hour meant only for terror. At midday, when the sun stood directly above Rome, the Colosseum revealed its true purpose. This was not the hour of glory or skill. This was the hour of disposal. The morning animal hunts were finished, and the gladiators had not yet entered. The crowd was relaxed, eating, talking, laughing. And during this calm moment, the condemned were brought out. Rome called them criminals. In truth, they were raw material for fear. They came limping, dragged, or half-carried by guards who had learned not to look at faces. Some were slaves. Some were freed women. Some were citizens who had offended the wrong person or challenged the wrong power. Guilt was irrelevant. What mattered was that the state had decided their bodies no longer belonged to them. From this moment forward, their suffering belonged to Rome. The arena sand was already soaked with blood from the morning's hunts. The smell never left. Heat pressed down, making every breath heavier. The condemned were left standing barefoot, dressed in thin scraps of cloth, exposed to thousands of eyes that barely noticed them. Children pointed. Men placed bets. Women whispered. This indifference was deliberate. Rome trained its people to see human death as ordinary. No one explained what would happen next. That was part of the punishment. The condemned were not told how they would die, only that they would die soon. Fear filled the silence as they watched arena officials consult wax tablets, discussing methods the way merchants discussed prices. Every execution was planned. Every scream had a time slot. This hour existed for a reason. It reminded everyone watching that Rome's mercy was selective. The law was not designed to protect life, but to display control. The arena was not a court. It was a warning. Break the rules, resist authority, threaten order, and your death would be used to educate the crowd. Ancient writers later tried to soften this truth. They spoke of justice, of tradition, of maintaining discipline. But their own words betray them. They describe how spectators preferred executions without armor, without shields, without delay. The less protected the victim, the more satisfying the spectacle. Rome did not want dignity. It wanted vulnerability. The condemned understood this as the minutes passed. They realized no rescue was coming. No appeal would be heard. No God would intervene. The crowd was not waiting for a fair outcome. It was waiting for something memorable. The officials knew this too. That is why death was never quick. A fast execution wasted the moment. Rome wanted suffering that could be watched, measured, and discussed. This system refined cruelty into art. Each method served a psychological purpose. Some deaths humiliated, some terrified, some erased identity completely. And the most effective punishments were saved for this hour, when resistance had already collapsed and hope was exhausted. As attendants finally stepped forward, carrying objects that caught the sunlight, a shift passed through the arena. Conversations slowed, heads turned. This was the moment when entertainment truly began. The condemned were no longer people, they were examples. Rome had perfected something dangerous here. A society that could enjoy suffering without emotion. A civilization that turned pain into routine. And the first punishment was about to begin, not with a blade, but with fire designed to burn slowly enough for everyone to watch. Fire made for applause. Rome did not invent burning as punishment. It perfected how long a human could stay alive inside it. This fire was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to be watched. The attendants did not rush. They never did. Speed ruined the effect. As the condemned stood trembling on the sand, two men approached carrying what looked, at first, like an ordinary garment. Linen, pale, almost harmless. Only when it caught the sunlight did its surface reveal a dark, oily sheen. The crowd understood immediately. A low murmur spread through the stands. This was not a surprise. This was a favorite. The garment was known across the empire. Everyone had heard stories. Parents whispered about it to frighten children into obedience. Prisoners prayed they would never be chosen for it. The tunic was soaked in pitch, resin, and animal fat, substances selected not for speed, but for control. When lit, it burned slowly, clinging to flesh, refusing to release its victim. This was execution designed with patience. The condemned was dressed while it was still cold. Arms lifted, fabric pulled over the head, tied tightly at the waist so it could not be torn off. Sometimes wrists were bound, sometimes ankles. The goal was upright suffering. Rome wanted bodies visible. A victim collapsing too soon disappointed the audience. The executioners were trained to prevent that. The arena grew quieter now. Food was set aside. Conversations paused. This was the moment people remembered. Flames held attention in a way blades did not. Fire promised duration. The attendants stepped back, torches in hand, waiting for the signal. The condemned could hear their own breathing, fast and shallow. They could smell the pitch. They could feel heat before there was fire. Ignition was ceremonial. The torches touched the garment at several points at once. This mattered. One flame could be smothered. Many could not. The fire crept instead of exploding, crawling upward, wrapping the body in light and smoke. Screams came quickly. Not dramatic screams, but broken ones, the kind pulled from lungs that had not yet failed. This was not death by flame alone. It was death by shock, by dehydration, by suffocation, by terror layered on terror. Skin blistered and split. Fat beneath the skin fed the fire, making it burn brighter, longer. The victim remained conscious far longer than modern audiences would expect. Minutes stretched. The crowd watched every second. Rome called this entertainment. Records show that officials rated executions based on reception. A well-received burning meant the flames lasted long enough. The victim remained visible, and the crowd stayed engaged. Pain was measured not in suffering, but in satisfaction. The body on fire was no longer a person. It was a performance. This method was not limited to criminals. During periods of political paranoia, religious persecution, or imperial vanity, it was used on entire groups. The message was always the same. Rome could take your life slowly, publicly, and without apology. Even the night offered no escape. Emperors sometimes used burning victims as living torches to light private gardens, turning executions into dinner decor. Ancient writers described these scenes with disturbing calm. They did not question the morality. They questioned the efficiency. Some noted how smoke carried the smell of burning flesh into the upper tiers. Others remarked on how crowds cheered louder when victims remained conscious longer. The culture had adapted. The audience had learned what to enjoy. Medical historians today believe many victims remained aware for several minutes after ignition, long enough to understand what was happening, long enough to feel the fire climbing, long enough to look out at thousands of faces and realize that no one was going to intervene. That realization often broke the will before the body failed. This punishment served a deeper function than fear. It erased sympathy. Fire dehumanized completely. Once flames covered a body, identity vanished. Gender, age, status, none of it mattered. Only spectacle remained. Rome understood this power. That is why fire was always public. Hidden suffering taught nothing. When the body finally collapsed or stopped moving, attendants waited. Sometimes they stirred it with poles. Sometimes a physician approached, checking for signs of life. Death had to be confirmed. The schedule had to continue. Another method awaited. Another lesson needed teaching. But fire was only the beginning. Rome had other ways to stretch death, other methods that turned suffering into stages. And next, the arena would open its gates not for flames, but for creatures trained to tear slowly, while the crowd decided how much pain was enough. When beasts became instruments, They said the animals decided who lived and who died. They said it was nature, unpredictable and wild. That was the lie Rome told itself. In truth, every scream followed a plan. When the iron gates beneath the arena creaked open, the crowd leaned forward with practiced anticipation. This was the punishment most Romans believed they understood. Condemnation to beasts sounded simple, even honest, as if the empire merely stepped aside and let nature pass judgment. But nothing in the arena was left to chance. Not the animals. Not the timing. Not the way death unfolded. What followed was not chaos. It was design. The condemned was brought to the center of the sand and positioned carefully. Sometimes bound to a stake, sometimes tethered just loosely enough to move. That choice mattered. Movement created hope, and hope made fear sharper when it failed. Guards withdrew. Arena officials watched from the edge, eyes not on the victim, but on the crowd. Satisfaction was the goal. Timing was everything. The first animals released were rarely the ones history remembers. Not lions, not bears. Dogs came first. Trained dogs. Lean, obedient, conditioned not to kill quickly. They lunged low, tearing at calves, hands, faces. Pain erupted instantly, but death did not. Blood flowed freely, dramatic but controlled. The victim screamed, fell, tried to crawl. Then, just as shock began to take hold, the dogs were recalled. This pause was intentional. The condemned was left alive, bleeding into the sand, struggling to breathe. Attendants entered the arena not to help, but to wait, to let the crowd look, to let judgment form. Spectators pointed out wounds. They guessed how long the body could last. Food was eaten. Drinks were lifted. Rome did not treat this moment as interruption. It treated it as commentary. Only then did the second gate open. Large cats emerged next leopards or lions, selected based on the crime and the message Rome wanted to send. These animals circled. They tested. They struck and retreated. A strong victim might provoke a killing bite. A weakened one did not. Instead, the attacks came in waves. Claws, teeth, withdrawal. Each retreat allowed pain to return, terror to rebuild, consciousness to cling on. Here, the condemned often realized the truth. Survival was not mercy. It was punishment. Every minute alive meant more pain ahead. There was no victory in lasting longer. The arena used endurance against its victims, turning the human instinct to survive into another source of suffering. Arena officials monitored everything. If an animal hesitated, it was provoked. If the victim collapsed too early, attendants intervened to keep the spectacle going. Whips cracked, iron prods flashed. Hunger, fear, and conditioning were tools, just like chains and fire. This was not nature unleashed. It was cruelty managed. The final animal was often the largest, a bear. By the time it entered, the condemned was usually broken blood loss heavy, movement slow, eyes unfocused. The bear's strength often ended the ordeal, but even this ending was judged. A quick death disappointed. A drawn-out struggle pleased. Records from the period describe these executions with chilling neutrality. Animals assigned. Exposure intervals. Completion time. Crowd reception. Pain itself was never mentioned. Different people died differently. Treason brought lions. Slaves who resisted authority were killed publicly to teach obedience. Foreigners were dressed as enemies of Rome, their deaths framed as symbolic victories. Identity was erased. The victim became a role, a warning, a lesson written in blood. Ancient observers sometimes claimed discomfort, but their concern was revealing. They did not condemn the executions. They worried the audience had grown too demanding. Writers noted impatience when animals killed too fast, excitement when wounds were visible, and how even children learned where to look. Rome was educating its citizens, not in justice, but in indifference. The pauses between attacks were remembered as the worst moments. Pain came and went. Hope rose and collapsed. Each new gate opening brought fresh terror. By the end, the condemned no longer fought to live. They waited to be finished. When the body was finally removed, the sand was raked smooth. Blood disappeared. The schedule moved on. Another lesson had been delivered without disruption. Power remained unquestioned. But even this was not the deepest cruelty Rome perfected. Animals could be blamed. Instinct could be claimed. Rome wanted something darker, something that erased innocence completely. And next, the arena would take away the beasts and force humans to become the executioners themselves. Forced to kill before dying, some entered the arena as victims. They did not leave as innocents. Rome found a way to stain the soul before it destroyed the body. At noon, when much of the crowd had left their seats to eat and drink, the arena revealed a punishment even darker than beasts or fire. This was the hour Rome considered unimportant, yet it was here that its most psychologically violent executions took place. The Romans called them the midday games. There was nothing playful about them. This was where the condemned were forced to become killers before they were allowed to die. The prisoners were brought out in pairs, sometimes strangers, sometimes people who had spoken briefly while waiting underground, sharing fear in whispers. They were given weapons, but never armor. No shields, no helmets, no protection of any kind. The weapons were real, sharp enough to kill, but skill meant nothing. Training was irrelevant. The outcome was already decided. They were ordered to fight. At first, some hesitated. They stood frozen, staring at the person across from them. Others dropped their weapons, refusing to participate. Rome had prepared for this. Arena attendants entered immediately, armed with whips and heated irons. Pain forced movement. Fire drove bodies together. Refusal only prolonged suffering. The lesson was simple. Kill or be punished until you do. The crowd watched with a different kind of attention. This was not spectacle like the beasts. This was intimate, personal. Two humans, stripped of status and identity, fighting not for honor or reward, but for a few more minutes of life. There was no applause for skill, only reaction to blood. When one fighter fell, there was no relief. The survivor was not freed. They were not spared. They were dragged away briefly, just long enough to catch their breath, just long enough to feel the weight of what they had done. Then they were brought back to face another opponent, and another. The process continued until no one remained alive. Rome turned survival into a curse. Ancient writers recorded these events with disturbing clarity. They described how the crowd preferred these executions to formal gladiatorial combat. There were no helmets to block the view, no shields to interrupt the violence. Every wound was visible. Every expression of fear was clear. The condemned had nowhere to hide. What made this punishment especially cruel was its purpose. It was not only about death, it was about transformation. Rome wanted the condemned to cross a line before dying, to carry guilt into their final moments, to erase the comfort of moral innocence. In forcing victims to kill, the state destroyed not just bodies, but identities. Some fought desperately. Some begged. Some broke down completely, unable to lift their weapons. All were eventually driven forward. Fire and iron ensured compliance. The arena allowed no passivity. Standing still was punished as harshly as resistance. There was only one escape, and it came through blood. The audience understood this dynamic well. They judged fighters not by courage, but by efficiency. A slow fight bored them. A quick kill pleased them. Bets were placed. Comments were exchanged. For those watching, the violence became conversational, something to be discussed between bites of food. Rome had succeeded in making murder ordinary. Psychologically, this punishment achieved what no other could. It forced the condemned to participate in their own dehumanization, to become instruments of the system that was destroying them. By the time death came, many were already broken beyond fear. They no longer resisted. They simply waited. When the final body fell, attendants moved in without ceremony. Weapons were collected. Blood was raked into the sand. No names were spoken. Records noted only timing and completion. The schedule continued. Gladiators would enter soon, and the crowd would cheer again, refreshed by what they had witnessed. This method taught a powerful lesson. Rome could make you betray your own values. It could force your hands to do what your heart rejected. And it could do so publicly, calmly, without apology. But Rome was not finished with humiliation. Killing was not enough. Some deaths had to tell stories. And next, the arena would turn ancient myths into scripts, and real human beings into characters who were never meant to survive. When myths demanded real blood, the crowd thought they were watching legends, familiar stories from childhood. What they did not see at first was that the deaths were real. Rome did not limit its cruelty to simple execution. As the empire grew wealthier and the audience more demanding, punishment evolved into something theatrical. Death was no longer enough. It had to mean something. It had to echo stories every Roman knew. This is how mythological executions were born, where condemned prisoners were forced to reenact famous legends, not as actors, but as sacrifices. These performances were carefully staged. Sets were built to resemble forests, mountains, temples, or the underworld. Costumes were prepared to transform the condemned into gods, heroes, or criminals from myth. Music played. Attendants guided movements. Everything looked like theater, except for one detail Rome did not hide. The death at the end was real. The condemned were not volunteers. They did not choose the role assigned to them. Identity was stripped away and replaced with symbolism. A thief became a fallen hero. A traitor became a cursed figure from legend. Rome used mythology to justify brutality, turning cultural stories into moral lessons written in blood. One of the most common myths used in the arena was that of Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun. In these executions, prisoners were raised on platforms or mechanical wings, lifted above the arena while the crowd watched. There was no wax, no feathers, only height. When released, the fall was not symbolic. It was fatal. The crowd saw the story end the way it always had, but with a real body striking the sand. Another favorite involved Orpheus, torn apart by frenzied followers. The condemned was dressed as the musician, forced to play an instrument while animals or executioners waited. The performance continued just long enough to remind the audience of the story. Then the attack came. Music stopped. Myth ended. Reality took over. These executions served a powerful psychological purpose. They allowed spectators to distance themselves from the suffering. The victim was no longer a person. They were a character, a symbol, a cautionary tale. By framing death as story, Rome made cruelty feel familiar, even justified. Some of the most disturbing reenactments involved sexual humiliation and transformation. Myths that modern audiences find unsettling were embraced without hesitation. The condemned were placed into elaborate devices designed to mimic legendary punishments. Survival was irrelevant. The spectacle mattered more than the outcome. The arena blurred the line between ritual, entertainment, and execution. Poets of the time praised these events openly. They wrote that the arena made myths real, that ancient stories had finally been proven true. What they celebrated was not creativity, but control. Rome had taken the shared imagination of its people and weaponized it. These performances were expensive. They required trained animals, machinery, costumes, and careful coordination. For this reason, mythological executions were reserved for major festivals or imperial celebrations. Their rarity made them more memorable. When they happened, they were talked about for years. Names of the condemned were forgotten. The scenes were remembered. What makes these executions particularly disturbing is how easily the audience accepted them. There was no confusion, no outrage. The crowd understood the rules. They knew someone would die. They knew it would happen on cue. And they stayed seated. For the condemned, the cruelty was layered. First, they were stripped of identity, then forced to perform, then killed according to a script written centuries earlier. Their death did not belong to them. It belonged to a story that would outlive them. Rome succeeded in something dangerous here. It taught its people to associate beauty with suffering, art with pain, and culture with death. When myths required real blood, morality dissolved into applause. But even these elaborate deaths were not the final form of Roman punishment. There were executions designed not as stories, but as statements of imperial power. And next, Rome would use fire, weight, and public time itself to show that some lives could be erased slowly, while the empire watched without blinking. The system that never felt guilty, there was no silence when it was over, no shame, no regret. Only routine, because this was never a mistake. When the last condemned body stopped moving, nothing changed in the arena. There was no pause, no acknowledgement, no ritual of closure. Attendants entered calmly, stepping around corpses as if navigating furniture. Blood-soaked sand was raked smooth. Broken limbs were dragged away through service tunnels. Within minutes, the evidence of suffering was erased. What had taken hours to endure took moments to clean. This efficiency was the point. The empire did not lose control during executions. It demonstrated control. Every method you have heard in this story, fire, beasts, forced combat, mythological death, existed because it worked, not at killing, but at teaching. Executions were placed between other events. Spectators ate while watching. Children learned where not to look and where to stare. Administrators kept careful records, but never of pain. They recorded timing, method, and audience response. There was no space in these documents for fear, pleading, or regret. Those details were unnecessary. The system did not need them. Later historians admired Rome for its discipline and order. They separated the arena from Roman achievement, treating it as entertainment rather than governance. That distinction is false. The arena was governance. It was law performed publicly. A warning delivered repeatedly until obedience became instinct. Rome did not hide what it did. It displayed it. Citizens were not shielded from violence. They were educated by it. The crowd was not a victim of propaganda. It was a participant. Approval was expressed through applause, impatience, boredom, and demand for escalation. When executions stopped shocking, Rome made them worse. There was no moment when someone stood up and said this had gone too far. No reform driven by compassion. The punishments changed only when tastes changed. Cruelty adapted to preference. That is why the system survived for centuries. When the empire finally declined, the arena did not vanish because it was immoral. It vanished because the structures that supported it collapsed. The idea behind it, public suffering as control, did not disappear. It evolved. It found new forms, new stages, new audiences. The most uncomfortable truth is this: Rome did not fall because it was cruel. It thrived because it was organized. The arena was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization functioning without empathy. And that is the legacy Rome never apologized for. Not the deaths, not the screams, but the lesson it proved. that when suffering becomes routine, humanity becomes optional, and the sand is never as far away as we like to believe.